Okay, so in the last 2 to 3 weeks that situation has shifted radically, and we find that the topic is constantly in the spotlight in a very highly politicised manner. As the day-to-day work of the CAB involves welfare benefits and debt in a very high proportion, around 60% of new inquiries nationally, we can only hope that the political spotlight will eventually prompt a willingness to look for long-term, tangible improvements and not simply be used for party political point scoring. But it's hard to be optimistic about that hope as things stand today. Why reform welfare? I've been working in the field since 1987 and would therefore state that radical reform of the benefit system has been very long overdue. The system is unbelievably complex. It's formed of overlying layers, some considered public policy mixed with political expediency, and it interacts in very complicated and difficult ways with both the wider economy and the national taxation system. In fact, it's been described recently as being like a rickety old house that you daren't try and improve. Because of the complexity and the difficulty of dealing with change, it's only been tinkered with a couple of more substantial attempts at reform over the years, but nothing really radical. There are loads of weaknesses with the current system, but there are 3 that I would like to particularly highlight. The first is that it's far too complex to understand easily. With wages and means testing, it's so complicated that it's very difficult to understand intuitively how much better off you'll be if you take paid work. In 2008, before the phrase universal credit was ever coined, we were talking in here at the Quaker Meeting House about how a serious effort towards simplification is essential. This is especially true where people with insecure family circumstances, insecure housing, uncertain health and insecure employment need something to rely on. So that's the first point, and hence the theory and the principle behind universal credit is a fundamentally sound idea. The second big problem with the current system is its complexity. It means that the bureaucracy just simply doesn't work oftentimes. There are administrative errors and delays. I would reckon probably more than half of the benefit inquiries we're getting aren't about the system as it's supposed to work, even under whether you agree with it or not, but about the system as it isn't working as it's supposed to work. And when this relates to the very resources you need to put food on the table, pay the rent, or pay bus fares to attend job interviews, it's got very severe unintended consequences. And the third thing that I would highlight as a problem with the current system is it leads to a lot of underclaiming of entitlements. It's so complicated that many people do not access what they are entitled to. And we understand that that is many more than is involved in overpayments or fraud. So you'd be looking for something much simpler and clearer, wouldn't you? The current wave of welfare reform started in 2011, and I took stock. I counted approximately 50 different decisions being implemented, of which the whole of universal credit counts as one. I think you can guess why we might be concerned that the simplification that is so desperately needed is being buried in many other agendas, not least the focus on cutting welfare expenditure that has eclipsed the principle of simplification. I just want to highlight 2 changes in particular that are direct contradiction to the overall principles that have been set out. Last April, overnight, there were changes to the hours rules for qualifying for working tax credit that meant many families that were striving to work were disentitled overnight, thus defeating the principle of incentives to work. This April, the council tax benefit systems have been localised, so that local authorities have had a matter of months to invent and implement their own mini schemes. It's just hard to understand how that can result in a simplified, more efficient system overall, or what the purpose of that approach could be. It means there's no single central resource that you can refer to, for example, or a calculation package that works right across the country, so that people can be empowered and know how changes of circumstances will affect them. The fact that local authorities have also been awarded pots of discretionary funds to mitigate some of the impact of the cuts is inherently worrying, because we're moving away from rights and entitlements that can be implemented fairly and consistently into the realms of more and more subjective judgments to distinguish the deserving from the undeserving. What we really hoped for was a carefully thought out and carefully implemented reform programme, ideally with cross-party support for its core principles. Before I attempt to briefly summarise the wave of changes that's coming in 2013-14, I need to try and get across to you the sheer scale of changes that are being undertaken. 20 years ago, I reckon, from my memory, we thought we were having a really bad April. It was the year that the whole council tax scheme came in, and at the same time a totally new system for calculating and administering child support came in. We thought that was a really bad year in terms of understanding training. That was nothing compared to the scale of change that we're getting now, and I think that's one of the things that people are finding difficult to grasp. The other side of it is that it's not just the changes as they come in. The current waves of proposals are coming, but we're still seeing big impacts from the changes that have happened over the last 18 months or so, or even before. So, for example, the changeover from incapacity benefit to employment and support allowance, and the massive problems there have been with the medical assessments done by ATOS are really a daily issue at CABs, and they're affecting people across the city. And in October, there was an increase in the minimum length of a sanction for job seekers allowance, so that if you didn't fulfil your job seeking agreement in some way, the minimum sanction went up to 4 weeks, so 4 weeks with no money. That could mean that you had been asked to apply for 9 jobs that week and you only managed to apply for 8. We are actually having really, really harsh decisions that are being put on our clients. Just for the current wave of changes, I'm not going to take questions as we go along, sorry, I can't manage that as well. Just for the current wave of changes, there are some really good resources out there summarising them. This is one that's been produced by Sheffield City Council. I was also going to give you a screenshot of the Citizen Advice website, and if I can get that up on the internet afterwards, I will do. It's kept up to date all the time, so as things are changing, they are changing their decisions and making alterations, so you can go on that and be assured it's up to date. And there's also, they do collect information about changes that are happening, so I could show you that it's got a report button there for people who are having problems with payday loans. They use the information that individuals provide, and they use that to lobby, and I'm sure there will be individual report facilities for the impact of welfare reform, so I'd urge you to use that. So just very briefly, what the changes are now. I know some of you will be very familiar with it and some of you not so familiar. Mostly, the first thing to say is that mostly pensioners are unaffected by the changes, and that's very important to bear in mind, because sometimes they're the group that is particularly worried about what's going to happen, so there's a bit of reassurance there. So from April 2013, the council tax benefit scheme becomes council tax support, as I just described. In Sheffield, that means that the maximum help you can get isn't to cover 100% of your bill, it's only to cover 77% of your bill. So for working age families, this is, the minimum would be £3.29 a week for one adult in the household, or £4.39 a week for 2 or more adults. This means that thousands of people in the city have received council tax bills with something to pay for the first time, or for the first time in a very long time, and they have not been expecting it. There is a limited hardship scheme for those who are unable to cope, but it's not very much money, and we don't really know how it's going to work in practice. The reason for the change and the amount is that the government has reduced the grants it's given local authorities by 10%, but then it's also said you mustn't affect pensioners. So the knock-on effect is that there's a much bigger cut to the support for people of working age. The other one that has had a lot of coverage recently, we thought it was going to have a big impact, and it will, is the under-occupancy rule, also known as the bedroom tax. You'll have heard of it because it's about when you've got extra rooms beyond your basic needs, and it reduces your housing benefit by 14% if you've got one extra bedroom, or 25% if it's 2 or more. It's estimated that in Sheffield between 6,000 and 7,000 tenancies of social landlords will be affected by this. Again, most people won't realise, because they won't see themselves as having a spare room. For example, if you're a single parent with a boy and a girl under the age of 10 who possibly fight like cat and dog, you might think that if they've got a room each, that's fair and reasonable. You won't think you've got a spare room, but they would be expected to share a room. And if you're pregnant and you've not had the baby yet, then having made provision for the forthcoming baby is not counted. You're still expected to regard that as a spare room. Another one that is going to have an impact on lone parents who don't have day-to-day contact with their children is that there won't be any provision for that. So I came across a case of a father who was being supported to have access to 4 of his children every weekend, and there won't be any provision for any extra space for them. The social fund is being split apart, and a lot of it is again being put to the local authority. So instead of crisis loans, in Sheffield they've got a local assistance loan scheme, which is to provide for financial support if there's like an emergency or a disaster. But there is a big gap in that. A lot of the emergencies and disasters are the ones I described before, like your money's not come through, there's been a mistake, the bank details are wrong, or anything like that. That doesn't count as an emergency or a disaster. Supposedly you should get some bridging help from the benefits agency, but we've got a lot of concerns about whether that will really appear. Also, in place of community care grants, there are local assistance grants, and they're going to follow quite closely the criteria that they have done nationally to try and keep things simple. You'll have heard of the benefit cap as well. This has got a lot of publicity because it mainly affects London and the South East. There will be probably up to 400 families in Sheffield that are affected by it. It's a cap on the maximum amount you can receive in benefits if you're a family that where no one is working 16 hours plus. People on disability benefits, if there are disability benefits in the household, that can protect you. That's being piloted in some London boroughs, so I would say let's see how that goes, because some of them, there are going to be massive numbers of claimants affected. Disability living allowance for people who are of working age is going to be gradually replaced by something called personal independence payment. It's based on a points system, so it will be work in a similar way to employment and support allowance. And I was very concerned to discover that in the Sheffield area, the agency that's going to be doing the assessments is Atos. There are 9 daily activities, some related to mobility. It's got some similarities to DLA, but there will be a lot of case law to come on it. If you're concerned about that, I would urge you to take a look at the Disability Rights UK website, which is really good at keeping up to date on any changes on that. And if you're worried about if and when you might be affected by it, there's also a government, Direct Gov has got like a PIP checker, so you put your date of birth and your postcode in it, and it can tell you what wave of change you might be affected by. It's only being piloted at the moment. The other big one is the 1 monthly payment of benefit, the universal credit, so that your benefits will be rolled up and normally paid monthly in arrears to one person in the claimant unit, one of a couple, for example, and that will include you receiving your housing benefit direct. Okay, I'm not going to go on to more about that because you can actually read it for yourselves. Over the last few weeks, it's been relatively easy to find loads of stats citing the facts and figures and the proportion of people, proportion of welfare spending on this and that. It's plastered all over there. I've brought some with me today. The government's own figures show the proportion of people claiming fraudulently is about 0.8%, but if you ask people, they think it's about 27%. why is it so hard to grasp these facts and figures? Well, if you think about it, since the financial crisis, the impact of economic changes has been affecting absolutely everybody, apart from Richie Rich. You know, promising small business did collapse overnight. Middle-income earners with good prospects of a secure future were finding themselves insecure for the first time. The housing market's still stagnating, and there's no let-up in the soaring cost of private renting. Incomes are frozen, hours of work are cut, and people are taking cuts in hours in exchange for not being made redundant. Fuel prices have gone up, retirement savings are not yielding anything that they did anymore, and the VAT on goods is up to 20%. So everyone's feeling the pinch. But the scale of suffering is completely different when you're actually looking at the proportion of cuts that are being made to people on the lowest incomes. And one of the reasons people find this so hard to understand is that human beings are actually rubbish at doing a rational appraisal of statistics and applying it to day-to-day life. I mean, a good example of this is that there's been research by this guy about people who make their income hedge fund managers, and when they're doing well, they always attribute it to, well, I must be very clever, I must be making good decisions. But actually the findings are that that is based on chance. So when people are doing well, they think, well, I worked hard for my qualifications, I've worked hard in my job, I've done everything well, that's down to me. Whereas if people are suffering or vulnerable or poor, there will be a tendency to go, well, it must be their fault. Well, it is, because they haven't had the good sense to be born in the right place at the right time. They haven't had the good sense not to fall ill or become disabled or to be a victim of crime. And they may have shouldered the burden of caring instead of advancing their career. These are problems in terms of getting people to understand what's going on. I'll be as close as I can. Last week, I heard it said that full-time work is when you break free of the welfare system. And the person who said it really, really believed the truth of that. But in a low-wage, insecure global economy, that just doesn't accord with day-to-day reality. It's completely unsurprising to CAB staff when they hear that there are twice as many children in poverty in working households nationally as there are in workless ones. They're tasked with the mundane, day-to-day chore of helping people draw up their personal budgets, and they can see very clearly where the gaps are and where the impossible gaps are to bridge. Wages are low, hours are often part-time, they're not guaranteed, but our experience is that still people will take up and juggle work whenever they can. The mechanisms of tax credits versus tax allowance, they don't make any practical difference whatsoever. It's only the practicalities of whether you can balance your budget and put food on your table. If you haven't had the kind of exposure to that daily adding up that you do get within the CAB service, there's a couple of places that you can go to kind of inform yourself and get a real feel for that. One is the site that is linked to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which is the minimum income site, where it's based on research about what people reckon is a reasonable standard of living. So you can go on that and play with different figures, and you can see what the shortfall is between, say, benefit level and what people would regard as just a basically reasonable amount. There's also really good resources on the 0 to 19 website, Shepherd website, which was set up to make people in the local authority and others working with families more aware of the actual reality of the impact of child poverty. There's loads of resources on there, so if you don't have the opportunity to have that deep understanding, you can inform yourself through other means. Finally, I'd just like to reflect on the current climate in relation to fairness and equality. The CAB service, you might know, was set up in 1939 at the start of the Second World War. It was set up to help people navigate all the social upheaval and the bureaucratic system, rationing and all the rest of it. And a few years ago, a public information film from that era came to light. It was very entertaining, and it was very much of its time. It was a fascinating glimpse of social history, with many things that are still familiar today in terms of grappling with bureaucracy, poverty, etc. But the overwhelming sense in that in that movie really was that the service was supporting a coherent society that was pulling together, and it was overcoming shared difficulties. Now that might have been a bit of an oversimplification, but it's really disturbing to me to reflect that this is not the tone of discourse and debate we've got today. And as I see it, the challenge in promoting fairness and equality is to capture the real, unsensationalised human stories underlying the statistics and communicate that really effectively to all those who are in a position to make a difference, whether it's a big difference or a small difference.